Welcome back to History for Hours. Tonight, we drift through the late-night streets of New York, where power didn't always shout. It lingered, patient and observant. This is the world of Benjamin "Lefty" Ruggiero, a man defined by loyalty over ambition, where trust was earned slowly and survival depended on reading the room more than commanding it. Lefty's life wasn't built on flash or headlines, but on routine, respect, and a quiet hope that obedience would one day be rewarded. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you truly enjoy these long, unhurried journeys into history's shadowed corners. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, let the city hum fade, and settle in as we ease into the weary, watchful story of Benjamin Ruggiero. The coffee was cold. Benjamin Ruggiero didn't notice. He sat in the back corner of the social club on Madison Street, watching the door like he'd been doing for 37 years. Old habits, the kind that kept you breathing in a world where most men his age were either dead or wearing a wire. It was 1981, and Lefty, everyone called him Lefty, had since he was a kid, was 65 years old, still wearing the same style suit he'd worn since the 50s, still showing up every morning like he was punching a clock at some regular job. Except there was nothing regular about Benjamin Ruggiero's job. He was a soldier in the Bonanno crime family, one of New York's 5 mafia families, and he'd been doing this work since before most of the young punks walking through that door were even born. But here's what made Lefty different from all the other wise guys, all the other gangsters who thought they were tough, thought they were smart. Lefty actually believed in it. The life, the honor, the loyalty, while other mobsters were secretly skimming, making side deals, preparing their exit strategies. Lefty Ruggiero showed up every single day with the dedication of a man who'd found his calling. And that loyalty, that unshakable, almost naive faith in La Cosa Nostra, would become both his greatest strength and his ultimate tragedy. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what happened to Lefty Ruggiero, to understand how a street kid from the Lower East Side became one of the most loyal soldiers in mob history, and then got caught up in one of the FBI's most devastating undercover operations, we need to go back. Back to where it all started. Back to the streets that made him. Benjamin Ruggiero was born on April 19, 1926, in New York City, right in the heart of the Lower East Side. If you know anything about New York in the 1920s and 30s, you know that the Lower East Side wasn't some romantic immigrant story. It was hard. Tenement buildings packed with families, 6 or 7 people sharing 2 rooms. The smell of garbage mixed with whatever somebody's mother was cooking. The sound of arguments in Italian, Yiddish, Irish, all bleeding together into one constant noise. Lefty's parents were Italian immigrants, working people, the kind who broke their backs every day just to keep food on the table. His father worked whatever jobs he could find, construction, loading docks, anything that paid. His mother took in sewing, her fingers moving constantly, even when she was too tired to see straight. They weren't criminals. They were trying to live honest lives in a neighborhood where honest lives didn't pay very well. And young Benjamin watched all of it. Watched his father come home exhausted, barely able to speak. Watched his mother's hands become twisted and scarred from the needlework. Watched them struggle and scrape while just down the block. Certain men walked around in nice suits, always had money in their pockets, always had respect. These men didn't break their backs. They broke rules. By the time Lefty was 12 years old, he was already running errands for the neighborhood wise guys. Small stuff at first, delivering messages, keeping watch, the kind of work they gave to kids who were smart enough to keep their mouths shut and hungry enough to show up every time they were called. And Lefty always showed up. There's a story, probably true, probably exaggerated the way all mob stories get exaggerated, but it tells you something about who Lefty was even back then. He was maybe 13 running numbers for a local bookmaker. One day, a bigger kid, 16 or 17, tried to shake Lefty down, take the money he was carrying. This kid had 30 pounds on Lefty, had a reputation for being tough. Lefty didn't back down. He fought, got beaten pretty badly, but he held on to that money like it was his own life. When he finally delivered it, hours late, face swollen, the bookmaker asked him why he didn't just hand it over, save himself the beating. Lefty looked at him like the question didn't make sense. "It wasn't my money to give," he said. That became his reputation. The kid who didn't fold. The kid you could trust. And in that world, trust was currency. Trust was everything. By his late teens, Lefty had graduated from running errands to doing real work. He became associated with the Bonanno family, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in New York. The Bonannos controlled rackets all over the city: gambling, loan sharking, labor unions, trucking. It was a machine, and Lefty wanted to be a part of it. Not because he was particularly violent or particularly greedy, but because he genuinely believed in the structure, the hierarchy, the old-world values of respect and loyalty that the mob claimed to represent. He got made, officially inducted into the family, in his 20s. The ceremony was everything he'd imagined. The oath, the pricked finger, blood on the saint card that they burned while he swore allegiance. The kiss from the boss. In that moment, Benjamin Ruggiero became a made man, a member of La Cosa Nostra, and he took that oath more seriously than most men take their marriage vows. From that point on, Lefty's life followed a pattern. He was a soldier, not a boss. He worked the streets, ran gambling operations, mostly. He was good at it, too. Had a mind for numbers, for reading people, for knowing when someone was holding back or when someone was trying to play him. He made money for the family. Not huge money, not the kind that made you rich, but steady money. Reliable money. And that was Lefty's whole identity. Reliable, loyal, steady. He got his nickname Lefty because he was left-handed, simple as that. Not because of some dramatic story or violent act. Just because he signed his name with his left hand, threw punches with his left hand, dealt cards with his left hand. In a world where everyone had a nickname that sounded dangerous, Johnny Sausage, Tommy Karate, Sammy the Bull, Lefty Ruggiero's nickname was almost boring. But that was fitting, in a way, because Lefty wasn't flashy. He wasn't trying to be a legend. He was just trying to do his job. But here's the thing about doing your job in the mafia. Your job includes things that would put most people in prison for life. Lefty wasn't just running friendly poker games. He was involved in loan sharking, which meant breaking bones when people didn't pay. He was involved in extortion, which meant threatening people's livelihoods, their families. He was part of an organization that solved problems with violence. And Lefty participated in that violence. He had to. That was the life. But even in that world, people who knew him said Lefty had a code. He didn't hurt people for fun. He didn't go out of his way to be cruel. He did what the job required and nothing more. To him, it was business. It was the rules of the world he'd chosen. You paid your debts. You showed respect. You followed orders. And if you didn't, there were consequences. Simple. Clear. In Lefty's mind, it made sense. The years went by. The 1950s. The 1960s. The 1970s. Lefty stayed a soldier. Never rose higher. Part of that was circumstances. The Bonanno family went through turbulent times, internal wars, leadership struggles. Part of it was Lefty himself. He wasn't a natural leader. He wasn't a guy who schemed and plotted to move up the ladder. He was a worker. He did what he was told. He made his money, paid his tributes to the bosses above him, and went home. And here's where Lefty's story becomes almost tragic, because by the late 1970s, after decades of dedicated service, after decades of showing up every day, following the rules, living the life, Lefty Ruggiero was broke. Not just struggling, broke. Despite all those years, all that work, he had almost nothing to show for it. Part of it was gambling. Lefty loved to gamble, and he wasn't particularly good at it. He'd bet on horses, sports, cards, anything. Win some, lose more. Part of it was the structure of the mob itself. As a soldier, you had to kick up money to your capo, who kicked up to the underboss, who kicked up to the boss. By the time everyone took their cut, there wasn't much left. And part of it was just bad luck, bad timing, bad decisions. By 1976, Lefty was 50 years old, living in a modest apartment, driving an old car, wearing suits that were starting to show their age. He'd given his entire adult life to the Bonanno family, and he had almost nothing to show for it except the respect of other wise guys and a reputation for being stand-up. But respect doesn't pay the rent, and Lefty needed money. That's when Donnie Brasco walked into his life. Actually, his name wasn't Donnie Brasco. It was Joseph Pistone. He was an FBI agent, and he was about to execute one of the most successful undercover operations in the history of American law enforcement. But Lefty didn't know that. Nobody knew that. All Lefty knew was that this guy Donnie, this young guy who'd been hanging around, seemed solid, seemed trustworthy, seemed like someone who could help him make some money. They met through mutual associates in 1976. Donnie presented himself as a jewel thief, a guy who could move stolen gems and other high-end merchandise. In the mob world, you needed guys like that. Guys who had connections who could turn stolen property into cash. And Donnie seemed to know what he was doing. He talked the talk. He dressed right. He showed respect. Lefty liked him. More than that, Lefty saw an opportunity. If he could bring Donnie into the family, if he could vouch for him and Donnie turned out to be a good earner, that would reflect well on Lefty. It might finally be his chance to move up, to make the kind of money he'd been chasing his whole life. So Lefty took Donnie under his wing, started bringing him around, introducing him to people, teaching him how things worked, the rules, the protocols, who to respect, how to show that respect. Lefty became Donnie's mentor, his guide into the world of La Cosa Nostra. And Donnie played the part perfectly, because Joseph Pistone wasn't some rookie agent stumbling through an undercover role. He'd been preparing for this for years. He knew the culture. He knew the language. He knew how to be a convincing criminal. But more than that, he knew how to be a friend. And that's what he became to Lefty Ruggiero. Not just an associate, not just a business partner, a friend. Maybe the closest friend Lefty had. They spent time together constantly. Dinners, drinks, sitting in social clubs for hours just talking. Lefty told Donnie about his life, his struggles, his dreams of finally making it big. Donnie listened, sympathized, offered advice. They went to the track together, bet on horses together, lost money together, and laughed about it. They became genuinely close in a way that transcended the business relationship. And all the while, Donnie was wearing a wire, recording conversations, gathering evidence, building a case that would eventually bring down over 100 made members and associates of the mafia. But Lefty had no idea. He trusted Donnie completely. The trust between Lefty and Donnie deepened with every passing month. By 1977, they were practically inseparable. Lefty would pick Donnie up in the morning, and they'd make their rounds together, collecting debts, checking on various operations, sitting in on card games, meeting with other wise guys. To anyone watching, they looked like what they were supposed to look like, a seasoned mobster and his promising young protege. But underneath that surface, something more complex was happening. Lefty genuinely cared about Donnie, not just as a business investment, not just as someone who might help him finally catch a break financially, but as a person. He worried about Donnie's safety. He gave him advice about everything from how to handle difficult personalities in the mob to personal matters. He treated Donnie almost like a son. And Donnie, or rather FBI agent Joseph Pistone, found himself in an impossible position. His job was to infiltrate the Bonanno family, to gather evidence, to bring these criminals to justice. But the man he was deceiving, the man who trusted him completely, wasn't some cold-blooded killer or ruthless criminal mastermind. Lefty was a low-level soldier, struggling to get by, who genuinely believed in a code of honor that, to him, was sacred. Pistone would later write in his reports and eventually in his book about the operation that Lefty was one of the most genuinely loyal people he'd ever met, criminal or otherwise. Lefty didn't cheat his friends. He didn't lie to his associates. He followed the rules of his world with absolute dedication. And that made what Pistone was doing even harder, because he knew that when this operation finally came to an end, when the FBI finally made their move, Lefty Ruggiero's life was going to be destroyed. But that was still years away. In 1977 and 1978, the operation was just building momentum. Pistone was getting deeper and deeper into the organization. Through Lefty, he met capos, high-ranking members of the family. He participated in illegal activities, carefully, always with FBI oversight, but enough to maintain his credibility. He learned about the internal workings of the Bonanno family, their conflicts with other families, their business operations. And all the while, Lefty kept vouching for him, kept pushing for Donnie to get made, to become an official member of the family. In the mob, when you vouch for someone, you're putting your own life on the line. If that person turns out to be a rat, an informant, someone who betrays the family, you're responsible. The traditional penalty is death. Lefty knew this. He knew the risk. But he believed in Donnie so completely that he was willing to stake his life on it. During this time, Lefty's personal life was complicated. To put it mildly, he was married, had been for years, but it wasn't a happy marriage. His wife knew what he did for a living, knew the risks, and she hated it. They argued constantly, about money mostly, about the fact that after decades in the mob, they were still struggling financially, about the long hours he spent away from home, about the danger he was constantly in. And Lefty had a son he loved deeply but didn't know how to connect with. The son didn't want anything to do with his father's lifestyle. He could see what it had done to Lefty, how it had left him with nothing despite a lifetime of work. The relationship was strained, painful. Lefty would talk to Donnie about it sometimes, late at night in some bar or social club, and you could hear the hurt in his voice. He'd given everything to the mob, and it had cost him his family. But he kept going, kept showing up, because that's what Lefty did. That was his identity. He was a soldier, a loyal soldier, and soldiers don't quit. Meanwhile, the Bonanno family itself was going through turmoil. There were power struggles, conflicts over leadership, tensions with the other New York families. In 1979, the boss of the Bonanno family, Carmine Galante, was murdered in a dramatic hit at a restaurant in Brooklyn. Shot while eating lunch, a cigar still in his mouth when he died. The killing had been sanctioned by the Commission, the ruling body of the American Mafia, because Galante had become too ambitious, too reckless. After Galante's death, new leadership took over. Philip "Rusty" Rostelli became the official boss, but he was in prison. The real power was with the acting boss and the capos who ran the day-to-day operations. And all of these leadership changes meant opportunity for some, danger for others. Loyalties shifted, alliances changed. You had to be careful about who you trusted, who you worked with. Through all of this, Lefty kept bringing Donnie around, kept vouching for him, kept pushing to get him made. And Donnie kept gathering evidence, recording conversations,
documenting crime,
learning the structure of not just the Bonanno family, but the mafia as a whole. By 1980, the FBI had enough evidence to potentially bring charges against dozens of mobsters. But they kept the operation going. They wanted more. They wanted to infiltrate deeper, to gather evidence on higher-ranking members, to build a case so solid that when they finally brought it to court, there would be no way for these men to walk. And Lefty, unknowingly, kept helping them do exactly that. One of the things that made Lefty such an effective unwitting source for the FBI was his love of talking. Lefty was a storyteller. He'd sit with Donnie for hours, telling stories about the old days, about famous mobsters he'd known, about how things worked, about the history of the families. He'd explain the rules, the protocols, the unwritten codes that govern mob life. And Pistone's recording devices captured all of it. Lefty would explain how the hierarchy worked. Soldiers at the bottom, then capos who oversaw crews of soldiers, then underbosses, then the boss himself. He'd explain how money flowed up the chain, how everyone paid tribute to the level above them. He'd explain the rules about not dealing drugs, a rule that was supposedly absolute but was quietly ignored by many members who saw the enormous profits available in narcotics. He'd explain how disputes were settled, how permission had to be sought for major decisions, how the commission mediated conflicts between families. It was like Lefty was teaching a masterclass in organized crime, and the FBI was taking notes on every word. But Lefty wasn't doing this to show off or to impress anyone. He was teaching Donnie because he genuinely wanted him to succeed. He saw potential in this young guy, saw someone who reminded him of himself when he was starting out. Eager, respectful, willing to work. Lefty wanted Donnie to avoid the mistakes he'd made, to rise higher in the organization than Lefty himself had managed. It was, in its own twisted way, an act of generosity, an act of mentorship, an act of love, Even the kind of paternal care that Lefty couldn't quite express with his own son but could give to this younger man who seemed to respect him, to value his knowledge and experience. And Donnie, Joseph Pistone, found himself genuinely touched by it, even as he knew he was betraying that trust with every conversation he recorded. There's a moment that Pistone later described in interviews that captures the complexity of their relationship. They were sitting in a car, doing surveillance on someone who owed money to one of Lefty's loan sharking operations. It was late, boring work, just sitting and waiting. And Lefty started talking about his life, about how he'd gotten into this thing, about what he'd hoped it would be versus what it actually was. He talked about the promises the mob had made, that if you were loyal, if you followed the rules, you'd be taken care of. You'd make money, you'd have respect, you'd have security. And Lefty had believed those promises. He'd given everything. And what did he have to show for it? Debt, a failing marriage, a son who wanted nothing to do with him, a daily grind that never seemed to end. "You know what the problem is, Donnie?" Lefty said, staring out the windshield at nothing in particular. "The problem is we believe in something that doesn't really exist anymore. The old rules, the old ways, they're dying. Guys now, they don't care about honor. They don't care about loyalty. They just care about money. And if you're not making money, you're nothing to them. Doesn't matter how long you've been around. Doesn't matter what you've done." Pistone later said that in that moment, he felt genuinely sorry for Lefty. Here was a man who'd dedicated his entire life to an organization that didn't actually value him, who'd sacrificed his family, his freedom, his future, all for a promise that was never going to be kept. And the worst part was Lefty still believed. Even knowing how little he had, even seeing how other guys got ahead by breaking the very rules Lefty followed so religiously, he still believed in the system. He still showed up every day, still paid his tributes, still followed orders. It would have been admirable if it wasn't so tragic. By 1981, the FBI operation had been running for 5 years. 5 years of Pistone living a double life. 5 years of recording conversations, documenting crimes, building relationships with mobsters. And 5 years of Lefty vouching for him, trusting him, befriending him. But the operation couldn't go on forever. The longer it ran, the greater the risk that Pistone's cover would be blown. There were already some close calls, moments when other mobsters got suspicious, asked too many questions, wanted to verify Donnie's background. Each time, Pistone managed to deflect, to provide convincing explanations, to maintain his cover. But it was getting harder. The FBI was also aware that they'd gathered an enormous amount of evidence. Hundreds of hours of recordings, documentation of loan sharking, extortion, illegal gambling, murder conspiracies. They had evidence against soldiers, capos, even bosses. They had enough to bring down a significant portion of the Bonanno family and potentially members of other families as well. The question was when to pull the trigger, when to end the operation, pull Pistone out, and bring the arrests. That decision was ultimately made in July 1981. The FBI determined that the risks of continuing the operation outweighed the potential benefits of gathering more evidence. They had what they needed. It was time to bring Donnie Brasco, Joseph Pistone, home. And it was time to destroy the lives of the men who'd trusted him. The extraction was planned carefully. Pistone was told to gradually distance himself from Lefty and the other mobsters to create plausible reasons for being less available. He started telling them he had business opportunities in other cities, that he needed to travel more. He began missing meetings, being harder to reach. Lefty noticed. Of course he noticed. He'd start calling, asking where Donnie was, if everything was okay. Pistone would make excuses, business complications, personal issues, nothing to worry about. But Lefty worried anyway because that's what Lefty did. He worried about the people he cared about. In late July 1981, Pistone had his last meeting with Lefty. They met at a restaurant, had coffee, talked about nothing in particular. Lefty mentioned some upcoming opportunities, things they could work on together when Donnie got back from his current business. Pistone nodded, played along, knowing he would never see Lefty again. Not like this, not as friends. When they parted that day, Lefty gave Donnie a hug, told him to be careful, told him they'd talk soon. Pistone walked away, knowing that the next time Lefty heard about Donnie Brasco, it would be on the news. It would be FBI agents explaining that the man he'd trusted, the man he'd vouched for, the man he'd treated like family for 5 years, had never existed at all. The arrest warrants came down in August 1981. The FBI coordinated a massive operation, arresting mobsters across New York and beyond. Dozens of wise guys were picked up, soldiers, capos, associates. The charges ranged from racketeering to extortion, from illegal gambling to conspiracy to commit murder. It was one of the largest mob busts in FBI history, and at the center of it all was the evidence gathered by Joseph Pistone during his 6 years undercover as Donnie Brasco. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves through organized crime. Not just in New York, but across the country. The idea that an FBI agent had successfully infiltrated the mafia had gotten so deep that he was being considered for membership, that he'd been trusted and accepted for years. It was unprecedented. It was humiliating, and it was terrifying. Because if Donnie Brasco was FBI, who else might be? Which other trusted associates might be wearing wires? Which other friendships might be fabrications designed to gather evidence? The paranoia that swept through the mob was immediate and intense. Suddenly, everyone was suspect. Old friendships became strained. Business partners eyed each other with suspicion. The fundamental trust that the mafia depended on, the belief that the guy next to you was truly one of you, was shattered. But nowhere was the impact more devastating than on Benjamin "Lefty" Ruggiero. Lefty wasn't arrested in that initial sweep. He wasn't one of the primary targets. The FBI had evidence against him, certainly, recordings of him discussing illegal activities, participating in loan sharking operations, collecting extortion payments. But compared to some of the higher-ranking mobsters they'd gathered evidence on, Lefty was small time. No, Lefty's real problem wasn't the FBI. It was the mob itself. See, in the mafia, there's a rule that's absolutely sacred. If you vouch for someone, if you bring them into the family or even just into your crew, and that person turns out to be a rat, you're responsible. And the penalty for that responsibility is death. Lefty had vouched for Donnie Brasco. He'd brought him around. He'd introduced him to made members, to capos, to people high up in the organization. He'd pushed to get Donnie made, which would have required the approval of the boss himself. For 6 years, Lefty had been the bridge between an FBI agent and the inner workings of the Bonanno crime family. And now everyone knew it. When Lefty first heard the news, probably from another mobster, probably delivered with a mixture of shock and accusation, he apparently refused to believe it. Donnie? An FBI agent?
Impossible.
There had to be some mistake, some confusion. Donnie was a good kid. Donnie was solid. Donnie was his friend. But as the details emerged, as the evidence became public, as the news showed Joseph Pistone's real face and explained the scope of the operation, Lefty had to face the truth. He'd been played, completely, thoroughly, for 6 years. The man he'd trusted, the man he'd mentored, the man he'd defended to other skeptical mobsters, the man he'd brought into his life, shared meals with, confided in, cared about, that man had never existed. Donnie Brasco was a fiction, a role, a performance designed to exploit Lefty's loyalty and trust. And now Lefty was a marked man. The Bonanno family leadership put out an order. Lefty had to answer for this betrayal. The fact that he'd been deceived, that he'd had no idea Donnie was FBI, didn't matter. The rules were clear. He'd vouched for a rat. He was responsible. And there was only one way the mob dealt with that kind of responsibility. Lefty knew what was coming. He'd been in this life long enough to understand exactly what that order meant. Other mobsters started avoiding him. Phone calls went unreturned. The social clubs he'd frequented for decades suddenly had reasons why he couldn't come around. Friends, or men he'd thought were friends, looked the other way when they saw him on the street. He was being isolated, shunned, prepared for execution. According to later testimony and reports, Lefty spent those weeks in a state of almost surreal calm. He knew he was going to be killed. He knew there was probably no way out. The family had decided, and once the family decided, that was it. You didn't run. You didn't beg. You accepted your fate because that was the code. That was the life you'd chosen. But Lefty also reportedly felt something else. Betrayal. Not just by Donnie Joseph Pistone, but by the organization he'd served for 40 years. Here he was, a man who'd never broken the rules, who'd always followed orders, who'd been loyal to the point of self-destruction, and now the family was going to kill him for a mistake he couldn't have prevented. He'd been fooled by a trained FBI agent, by someone who'd spent years preparing for that exact role, and now he was going to die for it. Where was the honor in that? Where was the justice? But Lefty didn't complain, at least not publicly. He went about his business, what little business he had left. He waited. He knew they'd come for him eventually. It was just a matter of when. What saved Lefty's life, temporarily at least, was the FBI. As the arrests proceeded and cases were built, federal prosecutors realized they needed witnesses. They needed people who could testify about the inner workings of the mob, who could explain the structure, the operations, the crimes. Joseph Pistone would be a key witness, obviously, but they needed more. They needed cooperating mobsters. And they had leverage over Lefty Ruggiero. The FBI arrested Lefty in late 1981, not on the most serious charges they could have brought, but on enough to put him away for a significant time. Then they made him an offer. Cooperate, testify, enter witness protection, and they'd protect him from the mob contract on his life. They'd give him a new identity, relocate him, give him a chance to survive. For most mobsters facing death, this would be an easy choice. Life in witness protection, even with all its restrictions and difficulties, was better than being murdered. But for Lefty Ruggiero, this wasn't a simple calculation. Cooperating with the FBI meant becoming a rat. It meant violating the very oath he'd taken when he was made, the oath he'd honored for decades. It meant becoming exactly what he despised, exactly what he'd spent his entire life promising he'd never become. It meant admitting that everything he'd believed in, everything he'd sacrificed for, was meaningless. Lefty refused. He told the FBI he wasn't cooperating. He wasn't testifying. He wasn't going into witness protection. He'd take his chances with the courts, serve his time if convicted, and deal with whatever the mob decided to do to him. But he wasn't going to become a rat. The FBI agents who interviewed him were reportedly stunned. Here was a man facing almost certain death from his own organization, an organization that had given him nothing but hardship and poverty despite decades of service, and he was refusing protection because of loyalty to that same organization. It didn't make sense. Not to them, but to Lefty it made perfect sense. It was the only choice he could make and still be able to look at himself in the mirror. The mob might kill him for something that wasn't his fault, but at least he wouldn't die as a rat. At least he'd die still following the code, still holding onto the one thing the mob couldn't take from him, his integrity as he understood it. But then something unexpected happened. The mob contract on Lefty's life was suspended. Not permanently, not officially forgiven, but suspended. Why? The reasons are complex and probably involve internal politics that we'll never fully understand. But part of it was practical. Killing Lefty right after the Donnie Brasco revelations would create more heat from law enforcement. It would be too obvious, too predictable. The FBI would be watching Lefty specifically because they'd expect the mob to try to kill him. Part of it was also calculation. Lefty was in federal custody, facing charges. He was probably going to prison. Maybe the mob decided to let the government punish him first, see if he stayed quiet, see if he truly refused to cooperate. If he served his time without talking, without testifying, maybe that would be punishment enough. Maybe his loyalty, even after being deceived, would be worth something. And part of it might have been the tiniest bit of sympathy. Lefty was old school. He'd been around forever. He'd been loyal his entire life. What happened with Donnie Brasco wasn't really his fault. He'd been fooled by a professional, by someone trained specifically to fool people like him. Maybe some of the older bosses, the ones who still remembered when loyalty actually meant something in the mob, felt that killing Lefty would be too harsh. Whatever the reasons, the contract was suspended. Lefty would live, for now. But his life, as he'd known it, was over. The trial came in 1982. Federal prosecutors brought racketeering charges against numerous Bonanno family members. Joseph Pistone testified, explaining the operation in detail, describing what he'd witnessed, what he'd recorded, what he'd learned. He testified about Lefty specifically, about their relationship, about the crimes Lefty had committed, about the conversations they'd had. And Lefty sat in that courtroom and listened to a man he'd considered a friend systematically destroy him. Pistone later said that testifying against Lefty was one of the hardest things he'd ever done. Despite the fact that Lefty was a criminal, despite the illegal activities he'd participated in, Pistone had genuine respect for him. Lefty had never been cruel to him, had never treated him badly, had, in fact, been nothing but generous and kind. Pistone knew his testimony was going to send Lefty to prison, and he knew that Lefty, even now, refused to cooperate or retaliate by testifying himself. During the trial, when Pistone was on the stand, Lefty reportedly just stared at him. Not with obvious hatred, not with rage, just stared like he was trying to understand how the person he'd known as Donnie could be this FBI agent on the witness stand. Like he was still trying to reconcile the two versions of the same person. Lefty was convicted. The evidence was overwhelming. Hours of recordings, testimony from Pistone and other witnesses, documentation of crimes. The jury didn't take long to reach a verdict. Guilty on multiple counts. The judge sentenced Benjamin Ruggiero to 15 years in federal prison. 15 years for a man who was already in his mid-50s, who'd spent his entire adult life on the streets, who'd never been locked up for any serious length of time. 15 years that would likely mean he'd die in prison, given his age and health issues. Lefty accepted the sentence without emotion. No outburst, no pleading, just the same stoic acceptance he'd shown throughout the whole ordeal. He was led away in handcuffs, and the courtroom moved on to the next case. Just another mobster going to prison. Just another soldier paying the price for a life of crime. But Lefty's story wasn't quite over yet. In prison, Lefty became something of a legend. Other inmates, especially those connected to organized crime, knew who he was. They knew about Donnie Brasco. They knew that Lefty had been at the center of the biggest undercover operation in mob history. And they knew that despite everything, despite being betrayed, despite being facing a mob contract, despite being offered witness protection, Lefty had refused to cooperate. That meant something. In a world where more and more mobsters were cutting deals, turning informant, testifying against former friends to reduce their sentences, Lefty stood out. He was old school. He was what mobsters claimed to be but rarely actually were. Truly loyal even when that loyalty cost him everything. Other inmates respected that. Guards who worked with organized crime figures respected that. Even some law enforcement officials privately respected that. They didn't condone his crimes, didn't think he was a good person, but they respected his consistency, his adherence to his code. Lefty served his time quietly, didn't cause trouble, didn't complain, just did his time the same way he'd done everything else in his life. Steadily, reliably, without drama. He worked in the prison library, read a lot, kept to himself mostly, though he'd talk with other inmates who approached him respectfully. Prison changed Lefty, but not in the ways you might expect. He didn't become bitter, at least not outwardly. He didn't rage against the injustice of his situation. He didn't spend his days plotting revenge or cursing Joseph Pistone's name. Instead, he became quieter, more reflective, like he was finally allowing himself to think about the life he'd lived, the choices he'd made, and what it had all meant. Other inmates who knew him during this time said Lefty would sometimes talk about the old days. Not bragging, not glorifying the mob life, but just remembering. He'd talk about the neighborhood where he grew up, about the men he'd known, about how things used to be different. There was a sadness to these conversations, a sense of mourning for something that had never really existed the way he'd believed it did. He'd also talk about Donnie sometimes, not with hatred, which surprised people, with a kind of confused hurt like he was still trying to process the betrayal. He'd say things like, "I really thought he was my friend. I really believed it." And then he'd go quiet, lost in thoughts he didn't share. The question that seemed to haunt Lefty most was this: had any of it been real? Had there been any genuine friendship mixed in with the deception? Or had every moment, every conversation, every shared meal and laugh been nothing but performance? Nothing but an FBI agent doing his job? Joseph Pistone, in interviews after the operation became public, would actually address this question. He admitted that the relationship with Lefty had become complicated in ways he hadn't anticipated. He'd gone into the operation expecting to deal with hardened criminals, with dangerous men who deserved to be in prison. And while Lefty was certainly a criminal, while he'd certainly participated in illegal activities that hurt people, he was also, in Pistone's words, a decent guy in a lot of ways. Pistone said that Lefty had been genuinely kind to him, had looked out for him, had given him advice not just about mob business but about life, had worried about him the way a father worries about a son. And Pistone admitted that he'd found himself sometimes forgetting he was undercover, sometimes just enjoying Lefty's company as a person rather than as a target of investigation. But ultimately, Pistone maintained the operation was necessary. The Bonanno family was a criminal organization. They hurt people, they broke laws, they terrorized communities, and Lefty, however personally likable, was part of that. He'd participated in violence, in extortion, in activities that destroyed lives. The fact that he was loyal and believed in a code didn't change the harm he'd helped cause. Still, Pistone acknowledged the tragedy of Lefty's situation. Here was a man who'd been taught that loyalty was the highest virtue, who'd been told that if he followed the rules and stayed true to the family, he'd be taken care of. And he believed it so completely that even when the family was ready to kill him for something that wasn't his fault, even when he'd been given a way out, he chose loyalty over survival. Lefty was a true believer, Pistone said in one interview, and that's what made him both admirable and tragic. He believed in something that didn't deserve his belief. Back in prison, Lefty's health began to decline. The stress of the trial, the adjustment to prison life, and decades of hard living were catching up with him. He developed heart problems, had trouble with his breathing. The prison medical staff did what they could, but prison healthcare wasn't exactly top tier, especially in the 1980s. His family situation remained complicated. His wife visited occasionally, but the relationship was strained almost to the breaking point. She'd spent decades living with the stress of being a mobster's wife, always worried that the phone call would come saying he'd been killed, always struggling financially despite his promises that things would get better. And now he was in prison, and she was alone, dealing with the shame and the gossip and the federal government potentially seizing what little assets they had. His son never visited. The estrangement that had existed before Lefty's incarceration only deepened. The son had made his own life, far away from the mob, far away from his father's choices, and he wanted nothing to do with any of it. Lefty would sometimes get updates, third-hand information from relatives, about how his son was doing, but there was no direct contact, no letters, no phone calls. That hurt Lefty more than anything else. More than the betrayal by Donnie Brasco. More than the mob contract that had been suspended but not forgotten. More than the prison sentence. The fact that his son wanted nothing to do with him, that the choices he'd made had cost him that relationship. That was the punishment that truly broke something inside him. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the Donnie Brasco operation continued to have repercussions. The trials went on for years. Dozens of mobsters were convicted. The Bonanno family was devastated, its leadership structure shattered, its operations disrupted. The other New York families were also affected. The paranoia about informants and undercover agents changed how business was conducted, made everyone more suspicious, more careful, more isolated. The FBI considered the operation a massive success. They'd proven that the mafia could be infiltrated. They'd gathered unprecedented evidence about how organized crime worked. They'd put dangerous criminals in prison and disrupted major criminal enterprises. Joseph Pistone became a legend in law enforcement, his techniques studied and emulated by other agencies. But there were costs too. Pistone himself had to live in hiding for years after the operation ended. The mob had put out contracts on his life, serious ones, with significant money attached. He couldn't live a normal life, couldn't go back to being just another FBI agent. He had to be constantly vigilant, constantly aware that there were people who wanted him dead. And then there was the psychological cost. Pistone had spent 6 years living as someone else. 6 years building relationships that were based on lies. 6 years watching people trust him while he was betraying that trust. That kind of sustained deception takes a toll. In later interviews, Pistone admitted that transitioning back to his real life had been difficult, that he'd sometimes catch himself thinking like Donnie Brasco rather than Joseph Pistone, that the line between who he really was and who he'd pretended to be had gotten blurrier than he'd expected. He also carried guilt about Lefty, not guilt about bringing a criminal to justice. He was clear that Lefty had committed crimes and deserved to be punished, but guilt about the personal betrayal, about befriending someone specifically to destroy them, about taking advantage of Lefty's genuine kindness and loyalty. If Lefty had been a different kind of guy, Pistone said in one interview, if he'd been cruel or obviously evil, it would have been easier, but he wasn't. He was just a guy who'd made bad choices a long time ago and then kept making them because he didn't know how to do anything else. Inside the prison, Lefty continued his quiet routine: library work, occasional conversations with other inmates, a lot of time alone with his thoughts. He was a model prisoner, never causing trouble, following the rules the same way he'd followed the mob's rules his entire life. Other mobsters in the prison would sometimes approach him with a kind of reverence. To them, Lefty represented something they respected. A man who'd kept his mouth shut when he could have talked, who'd turned down witness protection when he could have saved himself, who'd stayed loyal even when loyalty had cost him everything. Some of these mobsters were themselves cooperating witnesses, working on deals to reduce their sentences by testifying against former associates. And there was something almost shameful in how they'd interact with Lefty, like they knew. They'd taken the path he'd refused, and they weren't sure whether to admire his stubbornness or pity his foolishness. Lefty didn't judge them, at least not openly. He understood why people cooperated. He understood that the mob itself had changed, that the old rules weren't really in effect anymore, that everyone was looking out for themselves. He just couldn't bring himself to do it. It wasn't even a conscious choice at this point. It was just who he was. Being a rat was simply impossible for him, the way some people can't imagine betraying their religion or their family. It was fundamental to his identity. The years passed slowly. 1983, 1984, 1985. Lefty aged in prison, his health continuing to deteriorate. He had a heart attack in 1986, not a massive one, but enough to put him in the prison hospital for a while. The doctors told him he needed to take it easy, reduce stress, which was almost funny given that he was serving a 15-year sentence in federal prison for racketeering. During this time, the world outside was changing rapidly. The mob was increasingly under siege from law enforcement. RICO laws, racketeer-influenced and corrupt organization statutes were being used to bring down entire crime families. Wiretaps were everywhere. Informants were everywhere. The FBI had learned from the Donnie Brasco operation and was running more undercover operations, recruiting more cooperating witnesses. The Bonanno family, already weakened by the Donnie Brasco prosecutions, continued to struggle. Leadership changed hands multiple times. Internal conflicts led to more violence, more arrests, more instability. The family that Lefty had devoted his life to was falling apart, torn between old-school mobsters who still believed in the traditional ways and younger criminals who cared only about money and were willing to break any rule to get it. Some of the men Lefty had known for decades were being arrested. Others were being killed in internal mob wars. Still others were flipping, becoming informants, testifying against former friends. The world Lefty had believed in, the structure he'd thought was eternal, was crumbling. And Lefty watched it all from prison, probably with a mixture of sadness and vindication. Sadness because everything he'd sacrificed for was being destroyed. Vindication because it proved what he'd suspected, that the mob's promises of honor and loyalty had always been at least partially a lie. In 1988, something unexpected happened. Lefty became eligible for a sentence reduction. Not because of cooperation, he still refused to talk to authorities about anything, but because of good behavior, health issues, and changes in federal sentencing guidelines. His lawyers filed motions arguing that he'd served enough time, that he was no longer a threat to society, that his health was so poor that keeping him in prison was essentially a death sentence. The prosecutors opposed the reduction. Naturally, they argued that Lefty had been involved in serious crimes, that he'd shown no remorse, that releasing him would send the wrong message about the consequences of organized crime. But the judge, reviewing the case, seemed to take a more nuanced view. Lefty had been a relatively minor figure in the Bonanno family. He'd never been accused of murder or other violent crimes directly. He'd been a career criminal, yes, but not a particularly dangerous one. And he'd already served 7 years, was in poor health, and had been a model prisoner. In early 1989, the judge granted a reduction. Lefty's sentence was cut, and he was scheduled for release later that year. When Lefty heard the news, his reaction was reportedly muted. Relief, certainly, but also apprehension. He was going to be released into a world that had changed dramatically since he'd gone away. The mob he'd known was different. The streets were different. And he was a 63-year-old man with serious health problems and no real job skills outside of organized crime. What was he supposed to do? Where was he supposed to go? The mob had suspended the contract on his life, but that didn't mean it was forgotten. There were probably still people out there who blamed him for the Donnie Brasco disaster, who thought he should have been killed, who might decide to finish the job now that he was going to be out of prison and vulnerable. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero walked out of federal prison in November 1989. He was 63 years old, wearing clothes that didn't quite fit right, donated items from a prison release program, and carrying a small bag with his few possessions. No family waiting for him, no friends, just a parole officer's business card and an address for a halfway house where he was required to stay until he could prove he had stable housing and employment. The New York he returned to wasn't the New York he'd left. Times Square was being cleaned up. The neighborhoods he'd known were gentrifying. The social clubs where wise guys used to gather were either closed or under such heavy surveillance that nobody went there anymore. The mob itself was a shadow of what it had been, fractured by prosecutions, informants, and internal conflicts. Lefty had to check in with his parole officer within 24 hours of release. The meeting was brief and bureaucratic. The parole officer, a tired-looking man in his 40s who'd probably seen hundreds of ex-cons come through his office, went over the conditions. No contact with known criminals. No frequenting establishments associated with organized crime. Regular check-ins. Find employment. Stay clean. Lefty nodded to all of it. He wasn't planning to violate parole. He genuinely wanted to stay out of trouble, stay out of prison. But finding legitimate employment when you're a 63-year-old convicted racketeer with no work history outside of organized crime, that was going to be nearly impossible. He tried. According to later accounts, Lefty applied for jobs, basic things like warehouse work, maintenance, anything that would hire an older man with a criminal record. Most places took one look at his application and turned him away. Some didn't even bother with an explanation. Others were blunt. "We don't hire felons." The few places that seemed willing to consider him would do a background check, see the racketeering conviction, see the organized crime connection, and suddenly the position would be filled. The halfway house where Lefty was staying was in a rough neighborhood. Nothing like the world he'd once inhabited. Shared rooms, strict curfews, other ex-cons trying to put their lives back together, most of them younger, most of them struggling just as much as he was. Lefty kept to himself mostly the same way he had in prison. He wasn't unfriendly, but he didn't seek out companionship either. His health continued to be a problem. The heart issues he developed in prison hadn't gone away. He was supposed to take medication, supposed to see doctors regularly, but without health insurance and with almost no money, that was difficult. The prison had given him a 30-day supply of his medications and a referral to a clinic that served low-income patients. But navigating that system while also trying to find work and housing was overwhelming. Meanwhile, the question of whether the mob still wanted him dead hung over everything. Lefty had to assume he was being watched, by law enforcement certainly, but possibly also by the mob. The contract had been suspended, but suspended wasn't the same as canceled. And there were practical questions. Would the Bonanno family even acknowledge him? Would they help him at all, given what had happened? Or was he completely on his own? The answer came a few weeks after his release. Lefty was contacted. Exactly how isn't clear from available accounts, but likely through an intermediary, by someone connected to the family. The message was simple. Stay away. Don't come around the social clubs. Don't try to get back into the life. Don't contact any active members. Just disappear and stay disappeared. It wasn't a death threat. It was actually almost merciful in its own way. The family wasn't going to kill him, but they also wanted nothing to do with him. He was a reminder of the Donnie Brasco disaster, a symbol of one of the mob's greatest humiliations. As long as he kept quiet and stayed away, they'd leave him alone. For Lefty, this must have been devastating in a way that's hard to articulate. He'd devoted 40 years to the Bonanno family, had followed their rules, had stayed loyal even when it cost him everything. And now they were telling him to disappear, like he'd never existed, like those 40 years meant nothing. But what choice did he have? He agreed. He stayed away. He tried to build some kind of life outside of the only world he'd ever known. Finding stable housing was a challenge. Landlords were no more eager to rent to a convicted mobster than employers were to hire one. Lefty eventually found a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood. Nothing fancy, just a place to sleep and store his few belongings. The rent was cheap because the building was run down and the neighborhood had problems, but it was his own space, which was something. He lived very simply. His income came from Social Security. He'd paid into the system during the few legitimate jobs he'd held early in life, and that qualified him for minimal benefits. It wasn't much, barely enough to cover rent and food, but it was something. He supplemented it occasionally with odd jobs, cash work, nothing that would show up on official records, nothing that would violate his parole in obvious ways. His daily routine became almost monastic. He'd wake up early, old habits from decades of mob life. Make coffee, read the newspaper, paying particular attention to crime news, seeing which of his former associates were getting arrested or killed. He'd go for walks long, ones partly for his health and partly because it was free and gave him something to do. He'd eat simple meals, usually alone, watch television, go to bed early. It was a small, quiet life, a million miles away from what he'd imagined when he was a young man being made into the Bonanno family. Taking that oath, believing he was becoming part of something great and permanent. Occasionally, he'd see people he recognized from the old days. Former associates, other mobsters, people who'd been in the life. Sometimes they'd acknowledge him with a brief nod, a moment of eye contact that said they remembered who he was. More often, they'd look right through him, pretending not to see him, maintaining the distance the family had ordered. Lefty never tried to approach them, never tried to reconnect. He understood the rules. He was a ghost now, and ghosts don't try to rejoin the world of the living. His family situation remained broken. His wife had divorced him while he was in prison. He couldn't blame her, really. She'd waited years, dealing with the shame and the struggle, and when he went away for what looked like 15 years, she'd finally had enough. The divorce had been finalized in 1987, and by the time Lefty got out, she'd moved on with her life. They had no contact. His son remained estranged. Lefty tried to reach out once, shortly after his release. He got a number from a relative and called. The conversation was brief and painful. His son made it clear he wanted no relationship. Lefty had made his choices, and those choices had consequences. The son had his own life now, his own family, and he didn't want any connection to his father's criminal past. Lefty understood. Didn't like it, but understood it. And he didn't push. What could he offer his son anyway? What kind of father had he been? He'd been absent, involved in criminal activities, had brought shame on the family name. Of course his son wanted nothing to do with him, so Lefty was alone. Truly, completely alone in a way he'd probably never been before. In the mob, even when things were bad, you at least had the structure, the crew, the sense of being part of something. Now he had nothing, just himself and his regrets. During this time, the story of Donnie Brasco was becoming more public. A book had been published, Donnie Brasco, My Undercover Life in the Mafia, by Joseph Pistone, written with Richard Woodley. It came out in 1988 while Lefty was still in prison, and by the time he was released it had become a bestseller. The book detailed the entire operation, Pistone's infiltration, his relationship with Lefty, the evidence gathered, the eventual takedown. It portrayed Lefty as a tragic figure, a loyal soldier in a dishonorable organization, a man who'd been kind to Pistone even while committing crimes, someone who'd been betrayed by the very system he'd devoted his life to. Lefty apparently never read the book. Friends later said he couldn't bring himself to. What was the point? He'd lived through it. He knew what had happened. He didn't need to read Pistone's version. Didn't need to see himself portrayed as some kind of tragic character in someone else's story. But other people read it, and some of them recognized Lefty when they saw him on the street or in the neighborhood. "Hey, aren't you the guy from the Donnie Brasco book?" It was humiliating, being recognized not for anything he'd accomplished, but for being duped, for being the symbol of how thoroughly the FBI had penetrated the mob. Lefty would usually just walk away from these encounters, wouldn't confirm or deny, wouldn't engage. What was there to say? As the months and then years passed, Lefty's health continued to decline. The heart problems worsened. He had trouble breathing sometimes, would get chest pains. He was supposed to avoid stress, supposed to exercise moderately, supposed to eat better, but all of that was difficult when you're living on the edge of poverty with minimal healthcare access. He had a few more heart episodes, minor ones, thankfully, nothing that required hospitalization. But each one was a reminder that his body was wearing out, that the years of stress and hard living and prison had taken their toll. He was still in his 60s, not ancient, but he felt much older. Looked older too. Prison had aged him, and the struggle of trying to survive on the outside was aging him more. Through all of this, Lefty maintained his silence about mob activities. His parole officer would occasionally ask him questions, not trying to get him to inform, just routine check-ins about whether he'd had contact with organized crime figures. Lefty would answer honestly within limits. No, he wasn't associating with criminals. No, he wasn't involved in any illegal activities. And that was true. But he never volunteered information, never spoke about what he knew, what he'd seen during his decades in the mob. The FBI also approached him a few times. Different agents, different approaches, but always the same basic pitch. Cooperate. Tell us what you know about the Bonanno family, about other families, about how things work. We can protect you. We can help you. Lefty refused every time, politely but firmly. He had nothing to say to them, and the agents, having dealt with Lefty before, knew it was pointless to push. He'd turned down witness protection when his life was literally in danger. He wasn't going to cooperate now that things had calmed down. To Lefty, it was simple. He'd taken an oath. That oath might have been to an organization that didn't deserve his loyalty, might have been based on lies and false promises, but he'd still taken it. And breaking it, even now, even after everything that had happened, was something he couldn't do. It was the last thing he had left, his integrity as he understood it. His ability to say he'd lived by his code even when that code had destroyed his life. In 1993, 4 years after his release from prison, something happened that brought Lefty back into the public eye briefly. There was talk of making a movie about the Donnie Brasco story. Hollywood had gotten interested, seeing the dramatic potential in the story of an FBI agent infiltrating the mob and the relationship between Pistone and Lefty. The movie news spread through the old mob circles like wildfire. Hollywood was going to tell the story of Donnie Brasco, and Lefty Ruggiero was going to be a central character. For Lefty, this was almost incomprehensible. Not only had he been betrayed and humiliated in real life, now that betrayal was going to be dramatized, acted out, shown in theaters across America for entertainment. He couldn't stop it, of course. He had no legal standing. The story was public record, documented in court cases and FBI reports. Pistone's book had already told the tale. The movie was just the next step in turning Lefty's greatest shame into public spectacle. The film went into production in the mid-1990s. Al Pacino was cast to play Lefty Ruggiero. Johnny Depp would play Donnie Brasco. Major stars, big budget, serious Hollywood attention. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the real Lefty. Here was a man who'd spent his entire life as a low-level soldier, scraping by, never making real money, and now a major movie star was portraying him on screen. Lefty never watched the movie. When it was released in 1997, he avoided it completely. Friends who saw it said Pacino's portrayal was sympathetic, showing Lefty as a decent man trapped in a dishonorable system, loyal to a fault, ultimately destroyed by his own integrity. They thought Lefty might appreciate that the movie didn't portray him as a monster. But Lefty didn't care. Sympathetic or not, it was still his failure being displayed for the world to see. It was still the story of how he'd been fooled, how his loyalty had been weaponized against him, how everything he'd believed in had turned to dust. By this time, Lefty's health was seriously deteriorating. The heart problems had progressed to the point where simple activities left him exhausted. He'd been hospitalized several times with cardiac episodes. The doctors told him his heart was severely damaged, weakened by years of stress and poor health management. There wasn't much they could do beyond medication and hoping his body could hold on. He was 71 years old now. He'd outlived many of his former associates, some killed in mob violence, others dead from natural causes, still others in prison serving long sentences. He'd survived when he probably shouldn't have. The mob contract that should have ended his life had been suspended. The prison sentence that could have killed him had been reduced. Somehow, against all odds, Benjamin Ruggiero was still alive. But survival wasn't the same as living. Lefty spent his final years in that small apartment, isolated and alone. No family, no friends from the old life, no purpose or meaning beyond getting through each day. He'd wake up, take his medications, maybe watch television, maybe take a short walk if he felt strong enough. Then back to the apartment to wait for the next day. The loneliness must have been crushing. This was a man who'd spent his entire adult life surrounded by people. Other mobsters, associates, the constant activity of the social clubs and the streets. Now he had nothing but silence and his own thoughts. Sometimes he'd sit at his small kitchen table with old photographs, pictures from decades ago, images of himself when he was young and strong, when he believed he was building something meaningful. The pictures showed a different person, really, a man who still had hope, who still believed the promises, who thought loyalty and dedication would be rewarded. That man was long gone. In his place was this elderly, sick, broken version, living in poverty, abandoned by everyone he'd once considered family. On November 24th, 1994, Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero died of cancer in his small apartment. He was 68 years old. The cancer had been diagnosed only months earlier, lung cancer, probably from decades of heavy smoking. It had spread quickly, and with his already compromised health, there was little the doctors could do. He died alone. No family at his bedside. No old friends paying respects. Just Lefty and the inevitability he'd been living with for years. The funeral was small, barely attended. A few distant relatives who felt obligated to show up. No one from the mob world, they stayed away, maintaining the distance that had been imposed years earlier. Joseph Pistone, of course, didn't attend. He was still living under protection, still a target, and showing up at Lefty's funeral would have been both dangerous and grotesque. Lefty was buried in a modest grave. Noi laverat hadstone. No flowery epitaph. Just his name and dates. A simple marker for a man who'd lived a complicated life. In the years after his death, Lefty's story continued to be told and retold. The Donnie Brasco movie became a classic of the crime genre. Books about the mafia would reference him as the quintessential example of misplaced loyalty. True crime documentaries would feature his story as a cautionary tale. But these portrayals, however accurate or sympathetic, could never fully capture the tragedy of Benjamin Ruggiero's life. Here was a man who genuinely believed in something, believed in loyalty, in honor, in the structure and rules of La Cosa Nostra. He'd devoted everything to that belief, had sacrificed his family, his freedom, his future, all in service to an organization that ultimately valued him at nothing. When he was needed, when his loyalty could be exploited, the mob was happy to have him. When he became a liability through no fault of his own, they were ready to kill him. And when he was no longer useful or dangerous, they simply forgot about him. The final irony of Lefty's life was this: his loyalty, the very quality that he prided himself on, the thing he refused to compromise even when it cost him everything, meant nothing to the people he was loyal to. The Bonanno family didn't honor his sacrifice. They didn't take care of his family after his death. They didn't remember his decades of service. He was just another soldier who'd served his purpose and then became irrelevant. And yet, in a strange way, Lefty died with something many mobsters never had: his integrity intact, at least as he understood it. He'd never become a rat, never cooperated, never betrayed the oath he'd taken, even when that oath had betrayed him first. Whether that integrity was worth the price he paid is a question without a good answer. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero was a criminal who participated in activities that hurt people. But he was also a man who believed in something bigger than himself, even when that something didn't deserve his belief. His story is a reminder that loyalty without wisdom is dangerous, that dedication to a corrupt system makes you complicit in that corruption, and that sometimes the codes we live by can destroy us just as surely as the enemies we face. He lived his entire adult life in the shadows of organized crime, and he died in the shadows too, forgotten by the organization he'd served, abandoned by the family he'd neglected, remembered primarily as the man who'd been fooled by Donnie Brasco. That's the legacy of Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero. Not a hero, not a monster, just a deeply flawed man who stayed loyal to the wrong people for the wrong reasons and paid for that loyalty with everything he had.